Hello? I've got a feedback, so it's going to be a little annoying. But anyway, so as I say, I'm very delighted to be able to speak to you today, and I will be. I wish I could be with you, and I hope in the future I can be with you. And I'm very kind. It's very kind of these organizers to speak so highly of my work and my interest. So I'm going to talk about the topic here, promoting skills. So let me get rid of some of this. Okay, so I can't advance this now either. Damn it, this is really okay. So okay. So let me just discuss this issue. This is very bad. Somebody is tapping into my line at that end, and they're creating this problem, but it's at your end. So I don't know who's doing this. Somebody who's monitoring this is creating this. But let me just discuss a problem that is facing many countries. We know that poverty, inequality, and social immobility are problems that are around the world. One of the most common descriptions of the relationship between social mobility and inequality is something that's been called the Gatsby curve, in honor of a fictional character from the 1920s, US fiction. And the relationship that we see here is the following. It's plotting the income of the child and relating that to the income of the family. And that's the coefficient beta. That's plotted on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you're going to see the inequality of family income. And this relationship across countries shows how social immobility, as measured by beta, is related to the level of inequality in the country. Now, beta is sometimes called the intergenerational elasticity. That's if we use log income of child and the family. So it's an elasticity. And it gives us a relationship between family circumstance, in this case income, and child outcome, which in this case is income. And what we can see is the higher the value of beta, the more dependent, the stronger the influence of family income on the child's income. So in a situation where beta is equal to 0, there's no dependence. And we might characterize that as a relationship with no full mobility. And so full mobility is basically a goal that many societies would try to achieve. So you succeed, but not based on anything your parents did. The opposite would be a very high value of beta, where family income is strongly determinative of child income. And so the thrust of this article, the thrust of this whole graph, is basically that the more unequal the country is, measured by family income inequality, the more immobility there is. So, and the countries plotted, South American countries like Peru, Brazil, Chile, are very high, both in terms of inequality and immobility. And countries like Denmark, Norway, and Finland are countries that have a high level of mobility. Beta is very small, and also inequality is very small. So a real question that arises is what are the reasons behind this? And how can we promote social mobility and at the same time reduce inequality? So how can we promote the lives of children and do so in a way that promotes the benefits the society. So one way that people talk about solving the problem of poverty and social immobility is giving alms to the poor. Now that is redistribution through the tax and transfer system. And that is the traditional approach. And this is basically an approach that many countries and many periods have solved, that have approached. This is the solution. The poorhouses in Britain in the 19th century were a solution to this. People who were poor, couldn't pay their debts, were sent to poorhouses to work, and they were supported by the state. The US Great Society in the 1960s didn't have a poorhouse, but it did have a transfer of giving money to the poor. And the idea was we could reduce inequality and we could end poverty through large-scale cash transfers. It had also an approach called shotgun strategy. And that was without any understanding that we could invest productively at all stages of the life cycle. And the idea was we could invest in a poor person who was 10 years old or a poor person who was 70 years old, and equally efficiently do so. And their policies that were advocated at that time had another negative consequence. Besides taking people away from the workforce, it also took them away from society. It built projects and taxed their earnings so that they became dependent enclaves inside the larger society. This program was designed to promote social mobility. However, when you look at the progress, and this graph plots over time the correlation between a child's poverty status and his parents' poverty status. And what you see is that even in the period when incomes were rising through cash transfers, the dependence between a child and his parents became stronger. It certainly didn't go away. And that was the great hope of the Great Society. So the idea is that giving the poor money in one generation, you can improve the quality of outcomes in the next generation. So that was the goal. Many of these policies actually discouraged work, and they actually taxed the poor. That's no longer true. We've eliminated the tax on earnings. We now incentivize work for the poor, and we now have a very progressive tax and transfer policy. In fact, the United States has the most progressive tax policy and transfer policy at the bottom end of the distribution than any other country in the world, even the Scandinavian country. So there is a sense that we've solved some of the disincentive problems, but we really haven't solved them, because what we've done is, instead of rewarding work, we've actually started to reward withdrawal from work by participating in disability programs. So the poor are now better off than they were before, but they also are less attached to the larger society. And the policy is still in place that doesn't really fully prioritize the importance of investing at different stages in the life cycle. But I want to argue that an effective way to alleviate poverty and enhance social mobility is to build skills. It's not relying, at least solely, on tax and transfer policy, which is still the main vehicle used by most countries. But we should create a skill enhancement policy that draws on recent knowledge about the dynamics of the skill formation process. And we should recognize something that people don't recognize in public policy discussions enough. Skills are major determinants of flourishing lives. And we need also to promote inclusion and social mobility by fostering skills. Higher, more skilled economy builds successful lives. And it's a skilled workforce that's adaptable, productive, and can adjust to the technical change and the onset of new patterns in global trade. So we also know that building skills creates dignity, agency, and engagement in society. What we need to think of is a more comprehensive approach to building skills. And that's what I want to talk about. We want to think about how to address social problems. Now, one way that we address social problems in the past is by looking at fragmented solutions. And I mean looking at problems one at a time. So we look at saying, like looking at crime or looking at one problem, and then we say, let's solve that problem because it's in front of us. We should do it. And there's a common saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, because we know it's squeaky. We know we need to solve it. But I think we need to step back and draw on what we've learned in the last 50 years, 60 years really, about how skills are formed and what the benefit is across a wide range of social outcomes from building those skills. So here's an example of the fragmented solutions that are in place. So people say, well, for employment, we should subsidize job creation. For crime, we should have more police. We should have more doctors for health, build better hospitals. If we want to solve teen pregnancy, conduct pregnancy prevention programs, give transfers like I was talking about, promote housing programs, and to build schools to create skill and leave the onus of skill formation on school. Now, these aren't bad ideas, but there's a better way and more effective way, and a way that complements these approaches. And we know that the most effective ways are to sometimes tackle problems and their causes at the source and rethink public policy. Should we wait for problems to appear, or how? It really depends crucially on how well we can predict later life problems and target the populations at risk. So there's a study that's been done on a country to the south of you, New Zealand, and that's done by Terry Moffat and Avshalom Costi. And they've collected data on a cohort of New Zealanders from the time of birth into their middle age. They're in the late 40s now. And what they establish is something that it's a very basic principle of social science. Namely, that 20% of the actors account for about 80% of the results. This is one way to describe this is the Pareto principle, after the work of Vilfredo Pareto, who announced this idea years ago in one of his many insightful papers. And so what we know from looking at the New Zealand data is that a high need, high cost population uses more than half of all the resources. And many of the risk factors that are borne out in later life can be predicted by things that we know and can detect in early life. And so in this way, we can see targeting may be an effective strategy, and targeting early life may be an effective strategy. And let me show you what an effective strategy looks like. So here's their data. This is the New Zealand Dunedin. This, by the way, is all a European population, European origin population. So it abstracts from any of the issues about the Maori or some of the other indigenous groups in New Zealand. But what you can see is that roughly 22% of the New Zealand population, produces these problems. So you can see that 66% of all the social welfare cases, 81% of the crime, you can see 77% of fatherless families, fatherless children, I should say, and use of drugs and many prescription drugs. So they're serious social burden. And we can see that here is an illustration that we're getting, that much of the problems are arising from the poor people, who are this poor 20%. This is something that criminologists have long noted, that the criminal element in any population is a very small percentage of the entire population, but that population commits the most crime. But we'll look at the flip side of this. The flip side is, if we look at about 30% of the New Zealand population, they contribute to almost none of those problems I just mentioned. None of the crimes committed, little on social welfare, not much in obesity, not much in terms of other social problems. And so these problems are really, this is a group that's very low risk and not creating social difficulties. What do we know about those factors? Well, their study points out that at early ages, as early as ages 3 and 5, 7 and 9 and 11, we can see that prediction factors that we can isolate, like IQ, the ability to control oneself, the socioeconomic status of the family, and maltreatment, are really major factors. So we know that we've got a problem here. So the question is, there's a gap. And the question is, what do we do about populations at risk? And in many societies, the goal has emerged that the problem should be borne by the school, that the schools are the way of social mobility, and that they can solve some of these important gaps that children have between those who are affluent and those who are poor. This strategy misses the fundamental role of the early years in a child's life, and especially the role of the family in creating gaps. Schools play a role, but not the dominant role, nor can schools alone close the gap. And what we're going to come to in our understanding, and what the recent findings have shown, is that these schools have to be bolstered by families, strong families, and families that engage their children in constructive ways are the key for schools to be effective and for children to arrive at school ready to learn, and for children to arrive in the world ready to engage it in a socially constructive way. We need to understand what skills are first that are life relevant. There's a lot of research in the past that's focused on mainly IQ. What cognitive psychology focuses on that. But what we've come to understand is that cognitive, social, and emotional skills enhance the capacities of persons to function. It's the whole array of those skills. And so we've known that. I mean, the classic lesson that children learn, the story of the tortoise and the hare. And that's the story that somehow the persistent person, or the persistent animal in this case, is the one who ultimately succeeds. So the notion is to stay the course, not be discouraged, and to go forward and try to achieve goals. So we've come to a lot of evidence that these soft skills are very important. And so here's an example. So if we look at the role of IQ in explaining earnings, it explains a part of it, a small part. If you look at the variance of earnings, say lifetime present value of earnings, somewhere between 4 to 10% is explained by IQ. But that's only part of it. Other things like motivation, the ability to show up on time, the ability to work with others, self-regulation, self-esteem, health and mental health. All of these are important factors that cause people to go off and become more successful. So IQ is not the be all and end all. Higher levels of cognitive and social emotional skills are associated with reductions in crime, higher earnings, better health, higher civic participation, higher educational attainment, less teenage pregnancy, greater trust, and more agency, the ability of people to operate freely, to understand and function in society. These are the principal output of successful schools and families. So how do we produce those skills? It's not just school. Skill formation starts in the womb, long before children enter formal schooling. So if you can see, for example, achievement test scores, you can see that children, if you look at the topmost graph, this is the achievement test on the y-axis, and this is the age of the child. And it's following them from age 3 to 18. Below age 3, it's very hard to come up with good measures of achievement tests. So what we can see, though, is that these scores are basically staying flat. These are ranked scores. And so the gap between the most affluent children, where mothers are the most highly educated, and the uneducated mothers, children of uneducated mothers, this gap is very substantial at age 3. But the size of the gap is about the same as it is at 18. So in America and in many other countries, in these interior years between 3 and 18, the schools are very unequal, and the very topic of most discussions, which puts the onus on schools, schools are neither creating or eliminating these gaps. And so we have to ask more deeply, what causes these gaps? And what can we get at it? And I'm going to put out one idea that many people look at, and that is genetics. People say, oh, the children of smart mothers, the mothers are smart because they have the right genes, and they pass those on to their children. And so the gaps between the children of more educated mothers and less educated mothers is strictly a manifestation of genes. And I want to show you that this gap can be completely eliminated with the right kind of intervention. So what we should do is understand what the latest findings can show about how we can build skills. We have come to understand the wisdom of investing more in prevention and less in remediation in creating skill and solving social problems. And the notion is to try to build a skill base in a child early on so that the child can succeed in a whole series of tasks throughout the rest of his life. And so those children who are motivated when they enter elementary school or kindergarten will actually be the ones who succeed the most. Those are the ones that can take advantage of what life is offering them. Social environments and family not just the schools alone, are the major producers of skill. So we need to understand families and environments and its impact. The family is basically the cornerstone of effective skill development. We've learned a lot about the importance of the early years, and we've learned the dynamics of skill formation, that skills beget skill. Supporting the family and engaging and nurturing their children is key to success in education and learning at all stages of a child's lifetime. And we can come up with cost-effective and fair approaches. So here's an example of how family background is associated with fluency. You can see, for example, that children who are in the welfare status, in other words, their children, their parents are less educated, and they tend to be more less wealthy and have not many advantages, as opposed to professional children from professional families, where the parents are educated and there's wealth, or at least money. The difference in the vocabulary spoken or vocabularies heard at age, at a given age, it comes to about 600 words for the disadvantaged kid and about 2,200 words for the advantaged kid. And the nature of parenting changes as well. Parenting in disadvantaged families tends to be much more punitive and less affirmative, whereas children in more advantaged homes get many more affirmations and encouragement to go out and learn and explore. And so if we look at the vocabulary gap by age 3, you can see that the children from disadvantaged are having 500 words, as opposed to those from more advantaged families who have twice as many words in their vocabulary. So that's an early start, and the gaps will only increase. And more recent work by a group at Stanford has shown that vocabulary also is crucially dependent. It grows much more quickly in the higher SES family, social economic status family, and much more slowly. There's a gap, and if anything, the gaps widen as the children age. And we also see a similar gap in the way that money is spent on children. So you can see, for example, at the bottom, you have disadvantaged children. These are all US data. But over a period of close to 30 years, you see that the expenditures in real terms have basically been almost flat. It's increased a little bit. 50% increase is not small, but but look at the change for the affluent. You start from 3, and then you more than double it. You almost triple it. And so the gap in expenditure between the haves and the have-nots is enormous and growing. Home environments are associated with child outcomes. And so targeted early childhood programs reduce achievement gaps and produce better child outcomes. Successful interventions work with and encourage parents. They promote interactions between parents and children, and they're fundamental to child development. So what we need to understand is something that's not discussed much in public policy, and that is that the nature and level of parent-child interaction vary greatly, and they affect vitally the way that skills are produced. Normally, we don't talk about this, but this is crucial because many families are compromised all around the world. So let me give you some examples of programs that actually target families that start looking at children early on and target those disadvantaged children. And there are 2 that have received a lot of attention. There's a program that was done almost 60 years ago now in the Perry Preschool. It's a town in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And children were there, the children 3 to 4 years of age went to a school 2 hours per day. And in their program, they planned and they did, and they reviewed tasks. Simple tasks like drawing a picture or making a boat or maybe making a garden or potting a plant. So in activities that challenge the child, but challenge them not only to conceive a project, to execute the project, and to review it collectively. So that involves many skills, which we think of as both cognitive and social and emotional, working with others, collaborating with others, and assessing others. The ABCDarian program was a program 10 years later, and this was longer, more intensive, 8 hours a day, and children were starting much earlier, age 0, really, just after they were born, and stayed in this program until age 5. And so let me talk about what the consequences were of these programs. These programs both tried to stimulate children, encourage them learning and doing projects like this. So these programs are very, very targeted and effective in trying to build the skills of young children. And these were evaluated experimentally. So groups of children, some children were put in a treatment group and another was put in a control group. And these two different groups were followed for many years. And so for Perry Preschool, we have children now who are in their 50s, and they themselves have children. So we can look at the children of those children. The ABCDarian program, these for people are now followed through age 45, and they're quite effective. And we can follow their children, but they're still pretty young relatively to the Perry kid. We need to be able to then look at all of these skills that I claimed were very important in the life relevant. So in the Perry Preschool program, an early finding of many of these programs was the treatment group experienced a big boost in IQ, but then it gradually faded away until age 10. The control group caught up. And so many people said, we can't do anything. I mean, we can start, give them a little bit of a start, but in the end, they're going to come back to their genetic traits. And so there's a whole discussion. There was a book written in the United States by Charles Murray and Herrnstein on bell curve. And the premise was really based on this picture and many other pictures like it. And so Arthur Jensen's work, Jensen wrote whole books on IQ, and he was convinced that there was a strong genetic basis. Many still assume that IQ is important. Yet Perry was not a failure. We can follow, even though the IQ apparently ended up at equal between the two treatment and control groups, the children of the treatment group had far better life outcomes. They did better in school, had higher levels of employment and wages. They lived healthier and more socially productive lives. Despite this so-called fade out, 7 to 10% annum is the rate of return. So if we take an after-tax adjusted, so we account for any distortion, so the usual kind of analysis of welfare costs, we find 7 to 10% per annum rate of return, annual rate of return. And one thing that it did boost is executive functioning, a social skill, the ability to control one's life and passion. It's related to IQ, but it's distinct. This program gained its success by boosting social and emotional skills. And it even led to higher achievement test scores. People say, well, how can that be? IQs weren't higher. Well, because achievement tests capture knowledge that's been gained. And the children in this program were more motivated to learn and engaged in schooling with less disruption and more engagement more generally in productive activity. So what we saw was really an enhanced lives of the children who got the treatment. But fortunately, we can also follow their children. So we can look at the children of the children. And what we can see is that the effects of these programs are really important and lasting. So these kids are now in their 20s. So we can't follow them to 55. We have the Perry program to age 55. But if you look at the children of these original participants, we can still see how well they did in school, much better, how well they avoided the criminal justice system, how much education they achieved, and in a variety of dimensions, we can see how those children prospered. And that, I think, was very important. So we can see that not only the children are benefiting, but they're passing those benefits on to their own children. So how does that happen? You're engaging the child. The children of the original children were not enrolled in any particular program. They only had their parents. But what happens, you can see, among the participants, the male participants, and we're looking primarily, the male participants, were much more likely to be married, the treatment group, than the control group. So they created stable families. So they created environments which were very rich and stimulating for the children and encouraging, without a lot of family violence, without a lot of angry encounters between husband and wife. And so if you look, for example, this is the marriage rate by participants' age. And that's not just males. It's men and women. So the upper group is the treatment group, and here's the control group. There's a huge gap. But notice the gap is really pronounced in the child rearing years, between the 20s and the 40s, up to 50. And so what you're going to get then is a richer environment in which children are raised. And the parents are more likely to be married, and the parents are likely to earn more. And the parents, the cumulative arrest rates of the parents was much lower. So this is the arrest rate of the control. This is the arrest rate of the treatment of the children, of the parents of the children in the second generation children. So these are the original participants. So the original participants much likely to be to avoid the criminal justice system. And the same is true with cumulative arrest. ABC shows the same benefit. It started earlier, and when we follow the IQ score, we actually see that it starts early, it boosts it, and it persists into age 45. But what was the key, though, that was going on? How did these programs, and the children of these ABC participants are doing well, but we don't have quite the same measurements because they're still pretty young. Many of them still in school and are just still starting out, too early to really make a graph like I showed for Perry. But what we see is that improved parenting practices improve child attachment with the parent. And attachment and encouragement is really a key part of learning. It also had a positive effect on behavior and mental health. It had higher educational attainment, higher employment rate, reduced criminal activity, and better child and adult health. So here's something that's puzzling for many people. So we looked at the children of the ABC. We looked at the original participant. And we looked, for example, at their blood pressure compared treatment to the control. And you can see the blood pressure is substantially lower, almost 20 points, 18 points. Statistically significant. The diastolic blood pressure is also significantly lower, a good 14 points. We can see that there's less tension. We can see that there's more good cholesterol. And we can also see that there's less bad cholesterol. And we can also see that the metabolic syndrome, which is a good tip-off for being at risk for diabetes, is substantially lower for the treatment group. So these kids are healthy. And we follow these. We look at their health records. We look at the amount of money spent on them in terms of health. And so in a group we have at USC, at the Schaefer Center, we actually follow these children, and we can see how much savings there are in medical costs and the like. Well, but people will say, wait a minute, this is kind of like an educational intervention. You are teaching kids, to get along with each other, to plan their lives, to plan, do review, but it doesn't have, there was nothing explicitly to do with health. So why is there health? Well, there are health effects because these programs essentially created things like executive functioning and self-control. So children then manage their own lives. They ate better diets. They chose better diets. They exercise. They avoid risks. And they basically then look after themselves in ways that the control group never did. So these are the growth of these non-cognitive skills, the ability to manage one's life. And when we take these factors into account and look for a tax cost, a welfare cost adjusted rate of return, the overall rate of return is 13.7% per annum, which is a very high rate of return. For males, it's 14%, a little lower for females, because one of the major benefits is on reduction of crime. And that's much less an activity for females than males. But it does help women in the sense that it produces childcare. It's an 8-hour program. And so as part of the childcare for the women, it also produces benefits for the children who are in childcare. So enriched childcare can produce substantial benefits. So the enhanced income of mother pays for itself, it turns out. So if we look at these programs, I don't want to go through all the details. I guess I'm running a little low on time anyway. So I'll skip. But what you can see is that both Perry and ABC were very, very effective. And in many dimensions. And not only effective in terms of their own health, but also we look at the child's health. And these are younger kids now. These are late teenagers. We still find significant effects on things we can measure for ABC children as well. So there's second generation effects. So what's the mechanism that's underlying all this? So how does it, we showed you that part of the mechanism is that the parents are living better lives, earning more income, producing stable family lives, which nourish children. So what is it about the first generation children? What's going on? So what it does, this program, and these programs, it turns out, are enriching the home lives of children. It keeps parental engagement alive, active. And so long after children leave the program, the parents are still encouraging, nursing the child. So they're creating a cocoon. And one of the images that's used a lot in the child development literature is the notion of scaffolding, like a sculptor will, start building a sculpture from scratch, or maybe cut it away from marble, or maybe make it up from plaster. But the structure is going to have the property that you're going to be shaping the features of the child. And so just like we're creating a sculpture, we're creating successful lives. And the scaffolding here, we find where the child's at and take the child to the next step. And we encourage the child to try new things, to plunge and to learn, and to protect the child when the child fails, because failure is a part of learning. Learning is experimentation. So as we experiment, we really should need to learn. And so we need to understand and encourage learning. But the parents can do this. And don't forget, the parents or whoever's taking care of the child is with the child many more years, many more hours in a week, and many more years over the life of the child than any early childhood program. So parent interaction patterns with the children was greatly improved. So if we look at parenting in the program of ABC, Perry's on the left, and the ABC is on the right. Parenting improved. So more attention, better parenting, more guidance, less authoritative, more encouragement, less discouragement. And we can see that this plays an important role in creating the treatment effects of the children. But here comes the interesting thing. Remember, I showed you those gaps between the advantaged and the disadvantaged kids. So here, if we look at something like educational attainment, this is the gap between the treatment and the control. So in other words, this gap is the gap that you would find the relationship that a parent would, if I were to look at the child's education and correlate it with the parent's education, I would get a very high correlation. That's what this shows. That's for the control group. For the treated group, that correlation is 0. And if I look at criminal activity, there's a high correlation. If your parents are involved in crime, particular for boys, and you have the father who's committed crime, there's a much higher chance that your son will commit crime. But we break that link if these children have treatment. So the social mobility is totally improved. Remember that coefficient, that beta that I had at the very start of the lecture? That beta is 0 now, which means there's much more social mobility. So your place origin, what your family was doing, is less important in the sense of bad activity. You can overcome any adverse influences that the family might have. And so what we see is a very strong parental response to treatment. Parents are warmer. They're less authoritarian. And what do we think is the important ingredient? How did this arise? So there are many things going on in these programs. The children are taken there. They have nap hours. They go out at the museums. They go to zoos. They actually are read to. There's a whole series of activities these programs do. So the question is, is there a more cost-effective way to promote child development? I skipped over one slide quickly, but Perry costs $23,000 a year, $23,000 totally, US dollars 2008, and $2008. And ABC was close to 100,000. Now the rate of return is high, but the initial layout is high. And that can be very discouraging for groups of people that are limited in budgets and so forth. So one thing that we've done is we've examined programs that focus attention on one aspect of child development, and that's home visiting program. So let me tell you briefly about a program that I'm working with now. I didn't start the program. It's a group of people in Jamaica some 30 years ago, 35 years ago or so, 37 now, actually. The children were in a slum of Kingston, Jamaica. All these were poor kids in a slum. And they were broken into 4 different groups. One was no intervention, so that's a control group. Some were nutritional supplement because they suffered from various aspects of malnutrition. And others, though, were given cognitive stimulation. And they were given, and some were given both cognitive and non-cognitive intervention. So 3 and 4. It turned out that 3 and 4 gave the lasting finding. So we followed these children up to age 22, and we have a new study that follows them through age 30. And what we can see at age 30 is that the children in the control group are much more likely to go to college, have more years of completed college, and to succeed in school. And if you look at their wage distributions, the wage distribution of the treated stochastically dominates that of the control. So that's a powerful mechanism. So I'm not going to go through all the treatment effects, but I will tell you that we've taken this program to China. Now, this program in Jamaica it's a pilot program, and it led to many programs that have now been tried around the world. It's now starting to be tried in Thailand. It's been implemented in China, and I'll give you some results. And we went to rural China, in Gansu, if you know the country. It's very close, just south of Xinjiang, way out, almost against Kazakhstan. To be between Tibet and Xinjiang. So what these people are is very poor, remote area. And the program has the following feature, following Jamaica. So we go to the parents or the surrogate parents. Many children in China are left behind children. Parents migrate from the west to the east to get factory jobs. So frequently it's a grandmother who's taking care of the children. And so what you see then is that the benefits, and we look at these programs, a home visitor who's trained at the same level as that of the parent. In other words, about 8 or 9 years with school, not a college graduate, not a professional trained, but somebody conversant, goes to the home 1 hour a week and interacts with the mother or the caregiver and explains to the mother what kind of activity will promote learning for the child. And it's only 1 hour. And the target is the mother or the caregiver. And what's going instead is that these other kids who are in the control group are not getting anything. So we can follow these. We follow them now into age 6 or so. And we can see huge benefits in language, social and emotional, fine motor skills. So what this program is doing, it's teaching parenting. And it's something that we don't really think of sometimes, but many poor families, whether they're in Houston, Texas, Philadelphia, or in the Philippines, many poor parents, many poor mothers don't understand what a normal growth trajectory is for their child, what to expect, and how powerful their role is. And so in the Jamaican program, it was very easily transported into rural China. because the books, all the materials, the educational materials were made by the mothers themselves or the caregivers, and they used materials in the village dump. So it wasn't anything costly. There was no need for a heavy, even an internet presence. So what we found, though, when you look at these children, there's advanced level of cognitive and language skills. We see an enhanced social and emotional skills. We see enhanced fine motor skills. And therefore, we see a very effective program. But what does this cost? What did Jamaica cost? Remember, these kids were basically at the level they're showing substantial benefit, but the costs are much lower. In these programs in China, it's about $800 a year, US dollars. In Jamaica was about $500 US dollars. And so these programs were highly effective, at least in producing skill. I'll show you how they are in comparing to even the ABC and Perry in a minute. But I'll give you one final program. It's not based on the same curriculum, but it's the same principle, namely home visits. And the home visits are individuals who come every 2 weeks, fortnightly, as the British would say. And these children that are not the main target, it's the parents. The parents are trained by these mentors. They're given suggestions, games they can play with their children, and then they leave materials behind or help the parents build these materials and then leave it alone. Let the family take over. So it's very less intensive, much cheaper, those other programs. And yet look at the scores. If we look at cognitive scores at the age of school entry, the treatment group, the green curve, is to the right of the control curve. If you look at, for example, problems that children frequently have, the high treatment kids are much less in terms of activity, much less in terms of difficulty with peers, and much less difficulty in the sense of being self-generating and autonomous. We also know that these children who are treated are much more likely to pay attention and therefore do things that are more active. So if you talk to them, interact with them, they're more engaged. And we can also see that when these children go to school, we can see that kids that started with low ability are going to have a huge benefit, huge increase. And this is something that it really is, that people, and again, there's a health benefit that fewer of those children are overweight. And remember, it's not a health benefit, but not a health program, but it's targeting the parents to interact with the child and then to develop those social and emotional and cognitive skills. Now, how do these programs compare? If we look at the outcomes of children in the Perry program, what you see is the following. Remember that gap I showed you? This is the same graph I showed you a minute ago. This shows what the relationship is between the child education and the parents. Very strong association. That's for the control group. For the treatment group, no. If you go to the Irish program, which is like 5% of the cost, you're getting a huge removal. It's basically zero. Again, the beta that I talked about is zero. And so what we see that in these programs like Perry and ABC, in both programs, the home visiting programs or these omnibus programs that do more like ABC and Perry, the programs that are featured as iconic programs, these programs essentially, in terms of improving the home environment, the improvement comes more from the programs that are home visiting programs. And if you look at the growth of cognitive skills, the traditional programs are on par. This one's a little higher, this one's a little lower, but the home visiting programs are competing effectively. And then you can see in terms of, and remember, these are far less intensive, far less, but what it's doing, it's turning on the parent. It's making the parent a partner and a person providing attachment and encouraging the child to learn. And so we can see then huge gains in terms of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. I won't go on, but in terms of reading and many other programs, many other features, you can see, for example, that the Jamaican program and Preparing for Life are producing results on par with these more expensive, intensive ABC programs. And this Jamaica program is on par with Perry, which is much more expensive. And a similar finding occurs for, if you look, for example, at mathematics. Yeah, so what you find then is the skills produced. Look at this. What you see is the treatment effect for Perry and ABC at 45 and 50. Very high. Here's Jamaica at 31. And you can see these are very substantial. But now you can also see that the Jamaican program is on par. And so the much cheaper Jamaican program, much more robust, something you can take out of the city into the countryside, like rural Gansu. I'm sure that there are many areas of the Philippines and the southern islands, especially where in areas where it's very expensive to set up these programs, these more formal programs. But these programs like Jamaica can be used and transported. And you can see that in terms of employment effects, in violence, education, and the like, these programs are very comparable in terms of their effects. So what do we learn from all this? I think the universal ingredient of effective programs is they promote parenting, mentoring, and parent-child engagement. The early years are important, but there's a lesson that can be learned. For example, if we look at children somewhat later in life, these are poor kids in the Chicago area. They start at age 4, and it features mentoring through elementary school. And so these are very poor kids, but each child is mentored. And so this parenting, which is missing in a lot of disadvantaged families, is supplied by these programs. And if you look at the effectiveness of this program, you can see that at ages that in grades 3, 4, 5, and 6, children that randomized into the program have huge gains in terms of reading scores, in terms of achievement scores generally. So there's a huge gain. And this then suggests that mentoring is still successful. So you can see the treatment effects versus control, much higher achievement scores. So adolescence is another place where mentoring matters. There's a lot of work on this, and adolescent programs. There's a program in Germany run by Armin Falk and his group at BRIC. They are doing work showing, it's called Baloo and Doo. It's after a child's story in Germany about a bear called Baloo. And Baloo is effectively a mentor, a surrogate mentor. And the Baloo, but what really is the parent is not the parent. It's going to be instead a college student will come for a few hours a week, mentor and encourage the child. But that has huge effects on adolescents and in producing. So what we're all starved for is parenting, mentoring. We all need, it's very helpful to have encouragement and guidance, especially in the early years. But that's true through adolescent years. And what we've come to understand then is, when we think about the way human skills develop, we see that there are actually 2 periods of life cycle. before age 20. The early years are very important because they lay the foundation for the skills that later will be used and will give children turn them on and enable them to make full use of all the opportunities they face the rest of their lives. But also, it turns out that a lot of aspects of personality, self-control, are developed in the teenage year. And there's a biological basis for that. It's much talked about now is how the prefrontal cortex develops, the white matter that's controlling our behavior. This regulates decision-making and judgment and is captured by executive function. This is part of the ability to adjust to change and to cope with new things. And so we've come to understand that these skills are multiple in nature. It's not just IQ. It's not just years of schooling. That social and emotional skills improve cognitive skills, education, and health. So more people who can sit still, are ready for school, will benefit. Health essentially also promotes skill. And because you can then develop, but instead of worrying about your health and sickness, you can then take these challenges and take on these kinds of things. Remember, it's failure. Failure initially, and then starting and learning. So learning from failure is the way that much learning occurs. So it's learning by doing, but it's actually also learning by failing. And so I think we really need to encourage failing. We encourage failing, but we encourage it in the form of experimentation. And successful parents are ones who who cushion the child. They say, go out and learn, but then there's an attachment and they encourage and they comfort the child. And so they play a dual role. They kind of push the child out and let them take challenges, but they also comfort the child if the child fails. So this is something that turns out to be a fundamental principle. Now, and I'll stop very shortly. That dynamic complementarity is the concept that investing early creates greater receptivity to investment later in the future. It accounts for the higher future returns for children and that who are invested in early. And so this graph is giving you the marginal productivity of the first investment in a child. And so if you build the skill base, you make it more likely that the child will benefit all the way along. So it's not to say that investing here is bad. It's saying that the first investment should be here. And then when children are in schooling or doing job training, going to the university, if they have sufficient skills, they'll be able to take full advantage. And that's why the return to investment is so high. You make it early here, but then you make all the later subsequent life activities more productive. So it's a very basic idea, but it's ignored in current policy discussion. So I think we need to summarize matter. And so I think I want to convince you that skills matter, but they're multiple in nature. Skill gaps emerge early, and their importance and family background's real, but it's not all genetic. I showed you how this correlation between the parent's criminal activity and the child activity was completely broken in the next generation by intervention. So this is not just predetermined by your gene. We can address these gaps by intervention. And that's something that many people do not still know. And what we should also understand is that the families are main producers of skill. We need a comprehensive approach to skill formation. We need to think of what skills are and how we foster them. And we should recognize the compromised nature of many families. We need to have an empirically honest discussion about skill gaps and their sources. Many people, when they talk about how families are influencing the child's and creating these gaps will immediately get hysterical and say, oh, you're blaming the victim. We're not. What we're doing is honestly finding out what's the source of the problem, and then we're attacking it. So I will conclude with that, and I think this is the seed of a major skill program. So I'm not going to give you the standard OECD line and ILO line. I certainly think that schools and education are important. But what we send to school and how we support those children in school is as important, if not more important, than those other factors. So thank you very much for your attention.
Fascinating presentation, really enlightening, wealth of information and arguments about why skill formation matters since day one, that they have an impact on productivity, earnings, but more than that, as who we are as human beings as life goes on and we develop. Your points are absolutely fundamental in terms of understanding that this is not about providing fragmented solutions. It's a question of really understanding the much deeper issues that you brought up. A quick comment: we're really far behind in the schedule that we were allotted, but definitely having Professor Heckman here with us is a privilege. So I want to take a few questions. If also Professor Heckman wants to spend with here a few minutes. Alex.
Okay, a few minutes more. It's late here. Don't forget.
Thank you so much, Alex. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Heckman. It's very honored to hear from a Nobel laureate, and I'd like to commend you for your project with J.B. Pritzker about support for birth to age 5 programs for interventions, which is precisely something we pointed out this morning that we need to happen to ensure that the Philippines takes advantage of its demographic dividend, because of all the countries in the world, we have the most perfect pyramid in terms of the demographic pyramid. I have 2 points. The first point is that your case studies has been mostly in the developed countries like New Zealand. I would like to sort of...
oh, be careful.
You have Jamaica.
I gave studies from China and Jamaica.
Yes, sir. The point of comparison I would like to point out is that I've been looking very interestingly at the recent studies of Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo of Poverty Economics, where they did randomized controlled trials in Bangladesh, India, and some countries in Africa, where they tried different types of intervention and which specific interventions resulted in better outcomes. And I think one of them, and I don't know whether I just missed your point, is that intervention at the education intervention is excellent. But the problem in the Philippine situation is before you even get to intervene on the educational teaching side or even at the parental side, is the level of nutrition, where from 0 to 3, if they don't get the proper nutrition, they will be stunted and therefore they will not be able to benefit from any educational intervention. I'm sure you have looked at that, Professor Heckman.
Well, the Jamaican study attacked that very question. The treated children in the Jamaican study were actually stunted children. The original intervention was designed to improve the lot of stunted children. And so there was a nutritional arm. And so when you gave nutrition, that was one of the 4 arms in those studies that I mentioned. But what it turned out, that when you looked at the long-term consequences of these programs, none of the work by Banerjee or Duflo follows people for very long. We followed the Jamaican people till age 35. So these children are followed for 30 years at least, 35 years. And Duflo and Banerjee don't have anything like that. So we found that the nutritional effects fade out. There was an effect, but it didn't really significantly improve the lives of children. But what did improve the lives of children was the cognitive and social and emotional stimulation. In fact, that very finding was what convinced the government of China to switch its emphasis from solely looking at nutrition. China still has nutritional programs, to actually considering also cognitive and social emotional intervention. So it's interesting. I went to a conference in China some 10 or 11 years ago now, and they were talking only about nutrition. And so I stood up and I talked and showed them these results from Jamaica, and they were amazed. So they set up a parallel program in China, and it's flourishing now all over China, rural and urban China. It's cheap, it's flexible, and it's portable. So that's why I'm a little dubious about the long-run lesson to learn from the Banerjee Duflo study. How long was the follow-up? Do you know?
Peter.
Professor Heckman, I think the gentleman was signaling that he didn't know. I have a different question. Thank you
Okay.
very much for that wonderful presentation. I'm worried about the problem of self-selection in these programs you've mentioned. Perry, ABC, Darien, the home visit program. Were the participants versus the non-participants, the treatment versus control, really randomly selected? Or was there a
Yes.
self-selection element in the participation?
No,
That's my
that's something
question.
very important. And if you look at, it's a very good point you raise. It's an important threat to any validity of any of the such studies. But if you look at it, there was universal coverage. And they enrolled the entire group of children in the catchment area of the Perry, this is Perry, the entire catchment area of the Perry preschool, which was a disadvantaged area in this town near west of Detroit. And so there was 100% compliance. They were, at least people wanted to, everybody signed up to participate. And then among those people, they were randomized. But there was nobody was excluded. Everybody wanted to participate. And the same thing is true of the ABC program. And in the Jamaica program, there was a whole area that was targeted. So it was a complete neighborhood of Kingston. All children in that area were targeted. And all parents participated. Some randomized in, some randomized out. The same was true in China. China has a different experimental design, though. The experiments are done at the county, at the village level. So one village gets treatment, another village gets control. But everybody in the village is eligible, and there's full participation. 2 or 3% of the children didn't participate because the children had health issues, or the parents moved away and took the child. So I think it's a valid concern, and I would raise that of any study, and I completely agree. So I'm glad you raised it, and I think that's the kind of mentality you should have when people are sitting around talking about experiments. But I think in this case, it makes a big difference. And I think it wasn't contaminated. But we know studies where it has been. So I completely agree it's a concern.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, Professor Heckman. Thank you. My parental philosophy is benevolent neglect, but after hearing you, I think I'm changing my mind. So, you highlighted parental interaction, but there may be another channel towards which the programs that you have mentioned affected like later outcomes in life. I'm interested in probably the program improving socialization skills at an early age, meaning they develop the soft skills of relating with other people and kids, for instance. Therefore, some of the results where the control group is catching up in terms of IQ, the treatment group still has an advantage by enhancing their capability to extend and maintain their so-called networks. So if
Yes,
that's the case,
That's part of what I was talking about. Those are
Yeah.
some of the social and emotional skills that are frequently not discussed, but which we now measure, and they play a huge role.
yeah. And if that's the case, can there be alternative programs, even cheaper programs to enhance these skills outside the home? That's my first question. The second question I'm interested in is that do we have results from your programs of within family variation of outcomes?
Yes.
For instance, we
Yes.
have one child under the program and other children not in the program. So the point is,
Yeah.
are there externalities that extend to other children within the household? So
Both of them really
that
good
may be-
question. Let me take the second question first. What we've done is we have the information on the siblings of the children in the Perry program. So we know the siblings that were older and were not part of the program, and we have siblings that are younger. And it turned out that under the eligibility rules in Perry and also in ABC, if one child was in the program, the younger sibling could also enroll later. But the older siblings couldn't. So then what we do is we take a look at what the impact is on the older sibling, And we have the same data on the control group. And what we find is that the older siblings of the treated group children are doing better. So there's exactly that externality that you talked about. And so that it would make perfect sense, especially if you think that what's being triggered is the parenting skill. And so that's the part that I think is really is fascinating. And so you're building an externality. Exactly. So, and your first question was what? I'm sorry. I lost track of it because of the first question. The second question. Just
My
remind
first
me.
question, I already forgot, but I was wondering whether there can be alternative programs to enhance those
Oh,
socialization
alternative.
skills.
Yes. No. Look, I think everybody should go into these areas, recognizing that all knowledge is approximate. So I don't want to sit here or stand here and tell you or beam to you and tell you that this is it, this is the final word, it's revealed truth, and let's go forward and never consider it. No, there's plenty of room for alternative strategies. The original researchers were building these intensive programs like ABC and Perry because they really didn't know exactly how to approach. And so they tried lots of different things. And what I'm doing is saying the later program, probably in their own wisdom, observing those programs, pulled out what they thought was the most essential ingredient, which is turning the life of the child on through the parent. And so these parenting programs emerged from that study of those programs. I'm guessing now, I don't know, but I think that was probably the case. But there may be something better. I don't deny it. And I think there could be like family network effects, peer effects. Now, the one reason why I question that, in Ireland, some of the programs were given in very intensive, in neighborhoods that were, where the treatment and control groups were very closely bunched. And so you could use that. And there are other programs which had where they weren't closely bunched. They were either 100% or zero. So we had data from areas where there was no program, and a data from areas where there was only all children are in the program. But most of the children are in this mixed status. Some were in the program, some weren't. And so what we look for externality. We say the mothers get together at the sandbox with their kids. They go out to the playground and they would share ideas about parenting. And we thought there would be these externalities, but those externalities were not found. The externality within the family we did find, but not those externalities outside the family. At least not yet. There may be, I would guess if we had better data and we would find some effect within families through sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, the extended family would get the news. But I don't think, what we found in Ireland didn't suggest strong externality outside the family. But there's a possibility though. And so there's lots of ways to skin a cat, as they say. So I think what we can do is, but I definitely encourage exploration. And in fact, one thing we're doing, and this is a pilot program. We're conducting a pilot program in Chicago, but we're forming a relationship with a group at the University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen, the AIRS group. They're very good they're very excellent. They're good electrical engineers, and they're very good in software detection. So we can look at moods and so forth. And so what we want to do is to be able to monitor the children in real time. So instead of just going once a week, the mother should be able to then be able to have the child wear some kind of badge or meter and gauge a sense of where the child's at and then respond. It's a little bit like some of the treatments for diabetes, which do actually take blood samples. They take blood samples. Now there's a much less intrusive way. And you get the blood sample and then would then administer drugs based on the reading, say on the blood sugar levels and so forth. The goal here is to take readings on mood, intelligence, and then gaining how quickly the child's learning. So it's an adaptive learning strategy. And I'm all in favor of that, but we haven't tried it yet.
Thank you.
Not in these early childhood programs.
One final.
It's been tried in classrooms.
Muchas gracias, Jesus. Dr. Heckman, you mentioned in your presentation that apart from IQ, socio-emotional skills are quite important. In fact, some psychology experts and child psychiatrists say that EQ is a bigger determinant of future success. That said,
Right.
I have a 35-year-old son who teaches K-12. And he's sharing with me the experience that these young kids now are so attached to their phones that they really don't have much chance or opportunity or willingness to have personal interactions with their peers. In fact, he has to mentor one particular child whose only relationship is with his smartphone. Okay. Having said that, my question to you is this. I don't know whether your research, and I commend you for having that long-term follow-through scenario, but has your research started to capture this dissonance between among the young people, especially since the advent of the smartphone and their reduced ability to be able to socialize with others, work well with others, so that they become productive people within organizations later? Thank you very much.
Your point is well taken, but it's not well studied. Not yet. Not to my knowledge. To me, I actually like to walk in the woods. And one thing that I've noticed, very strangely, is a lot of the younger people walking in the woods. Here, there's this glorious nature, you know, lilac bushes blooming, wildflowers, you know, the green of the trees, and they're looking at their phones. And another phenomenon, which I think is equally pathological, is two couples walking down the street. they're next to each other, holding arms, their arms are locked together. So the woman and the man are each looking at their phones, not at each other and not talking. So I completely agree that it's going to probably lead to a real form of isolation. And it's a form of contact, but it's not the contact that's really producing these social skills. And I personally don't think it's a substitute, but I think it's a real concern. And I know that some child experts have noticed that children who are, busy playing video games or looking at their smartphones or whatever are more isolated and even can become social threats in the sense they're kind of isolated. The whole phenomenon of what's called an incel, these people who are completely isolated from the outside world, has become a real problem. I know in Japan, there are hundreds of thousands of boys primarily living at home, playing video games, but they're not going out. They actually don't have any girlfriends. They don't have any friends, really. They're just really playing video games. And so I can only imagine that it's a little bit like putting somebody in an isolation cell. So I wonder, one of my desires, but I've never been able to achieve, is just to measure the effect of putting somebody in solitary confinement. I mean, they're put in solitary confinement anyway. So I've just asked certain prisons and authorities if I can have the right to sort of examine people over years, not to take physical exams, but just to test their mental acuity and their ability to socialize and so forth. And I can only imagine that this deteriorates badly, even IQ, I would guess. So I completely agree. This isolation we've created a new technology that takes people away from reality and takes people away from social life. And so, but maybe, remember, people evolve. So maybe someday, we'll all have smartphones instead of ears. And that maybe someday we'll evolve in such a way that we will just be able to communicate with each other's smartphone. And I don't know if you ever saw this movie. There was a movie about a man who fell in love with the operating system on his PC. And so it was a little bit sad because the operating system could deal with hundreds of thousands of lovers. And when he found out that he was not the only one, he was crushed. But still, during much of the movie, it was plausible. You could talk to a computer. And in this case, the computer gave you feedback like a human being. So this was his way of communicating. I mean, there is a whole surrogate humanity culture. I mean, you've heard these discussions in Spain. They're creating these women, robots, that are serving the purposes of as sexual partners and as social partners for these incels. It's very hard to believe that they're satisfying, and I never really participated or studied it closely, but it's a real phenomenon that people are so isolated. And so I can imagine that a more isolated population is going to be a population that's probably much less healthy mentally and probably more subject to violence and to disorder, because when we think about functioning society, a lot of it is kind of accepting each other, admitting somebody is better than you or worse than you, a better argument appears, or a better politician shows up and you listen. So there's that give and take that's missing. So I don't know, maybe we can program all this, but I don't think I don't think the spontaneity of life and autonomy is going to be captured yet by any android.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are approaching the 2 hours of the session. Really would attest to the interest that we all have in interacting with Professor Heckman, but I'm afraid we really need to start wrapping up. This has been really a super enlightening session with our guest speaker, Professor James Heckman. Professor, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure meeting you, and thank you so much.
Well, someday I'd like to
Definitely look
visit the
forward to
Philippines.
seeing you in Manila. So please join me again in thanking Professor Heckman. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, good night.
Good night. Good night to you. See you. Bye.
Okay, good night.